In this video, we'll look at every person executed in the United States in the first 6 months of 2025. We'll walk through the crimes that put them on death row, the final words they spoke, and the last meals they requested before facing execution. But before we start, let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. The first execution of the year happened on January 31st, 2025. After spending nearly 23 years on death row, Marion Bowman Jr. was executed by lethal injection in South Carolina. But what did he do that got him on death row in the first place? On February 17, 2001, Candy Louise Martin's burned body was found in the trunk of her burned car in Dorchester County, South Carolina. The day before, 20-year-old Marion Bowman Jr. saw Candy and asked her to return money he had loaned her. But when she told him to wait while she continued her conversation, he got angry. According to witnesses, he then said, "That bitch will be dead by dark." And that evening, he made good on that promise. Candy picked up Marion and his cousin, James Tywin Gadsden, to go to a party. But Marion asked her to take a detour through a remote area. Here, they got out of the car. Marion then pulled out a gun and shot Candy as she walked ahead. But she didn't die immediately, and she begged him for her life, saying she had a child, but Marion didn't care. He fired twice more, killing her, and then dragged her body into the woods. They took her car and drove back to the city, where he bragged about the murder and tried to sell Candy's car. But nobody wanted to buy the car, so that night, he returned to the woods with his friend, Travis Felder. They pulled Candy's body from the woods, stuffed it in the trunk, and set the car on fire. After that, Travis drove him back to Branchville, and they went home like nothing had happened. But by morning, it was over. Police arrested Marion and found Candy's wristwatch in his pants pocket. Marion was convicted of first-degree murder in 2001 and sentenced to death. Over the years, his appeals focused on claims of ineffective legal representation and mental illness, but each one of them was denied. On January 31st, 2025, Marion was executed by lethal injection at Broad River Correctional Institution. In his prepared last words, he said, "I did not kill Candy Martin. I'm innocent of the crimes I'm here to die for. I know that Candy's family is in pain. They are justifiably angry. If my death brings them some relief and ability to focus on the good times and funny stories, then I guess it will have served a purpose. I hope they find peace." If you want to read the full statement, I suggest you pause the video here. For his last meal, he requested a feast: fried shrimp, oysters, fish, chicken wings, chicken tenders, onion rings, banana pudding, German chocolate cake, pineapple juice, and cranberry juice. He was pronounced dead at 6:27 p.m. Marion Bowman Jr. was 44 years old. The next execution was scheduled for February 5th, 2025. After spending 12 years on death row, Stephen LaWayne Nelson was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. But what did he do to end up on death row? On March 3, 2011, Stephen entered North Point Baptist Church in Arlington, Texas, intending to rob the place. Inside, he found Pastor Clint Dobson and church secretary Judy Elliott. Stephen attacked them both, strangling Clint with a computer cord and suffocating him with a plastic bag. Judy was brutally beaten, suffering severe injuries to her face, head, and body. After leaving them for dead, Stephen stole Clint's laptop and phone along with Judy's credit cards and car. He later used the credit cards to buy clothes and jewelry and sold the stolen laptop for cash. Police linked Stephen to the crime after finding Clint and Judy's belongings in his possession, along with bloodstains on his shoes that matched both victims. He was arrested after failing to report to his probation officer on the day of the murder. A jury convicted him of capital murder in 2012, sentencing him to death. His appeals, which argued against procedural errors in his trial, were denied. While awaiting trial in jail, Stephen was known for violent outbursts, including breaking prison property and threatening officers. And to make things even worse, in 2012, Stephen was accused of killing fellow inmate Jonathan Holden, a mentally ill prisoner, after allegedly tricking him into a fake suicide attempt. Stephen used a noose made from blankets to strangle Jonathan and reportedly celebrated afterward playing air guitar with a broom. Stephen spent the next 12 years on death row inside Texas's Polunsky unit. He filed appeals at every level, state courts, federal judges, even the U.S. Supreme Court, but all of them failed. When his final day came, Stephen wasn't allowed to choose a special final meal and just had what the other inmates were having that day. On February 5, 2025, Stephen lay strapped to the gurney, eyes fixed on a woman he had never touched outside of prison walls. She was his wife, a pen pal he had met 5 years earlier and married just 3 months before. His final words weren't for the victims. They were for her. "I will always love you no matter. Our love is uncontrollable. There is no definition and no felling. I'm thankful and grateful. It is what it is. Always live for me and enjoy life. Give Monkey a hug for me. No, I am not scared. It's cold shit in here. I'm at peace. I'm ready to be at home. Let's ride, Warden." The warden gave the signal, and the injection began to flow. Stephen turned toward the glass, looking at his wife and dog one more time. "Let me go to sleep," he told her. The word love slipped out as his voice faded. His body tensed. He gasped twice and appeared to try to hold his breath. His head, shoulders, and arms trembled for a few seconds before all movement stopped. He was pronounced dead 24 minutes later, at 6:50 p.m. He died just 13 days before his 38th birthday. Just 1 day later, the next execution was scheduled, this time in Alabama. On February 6, 2025, after spending more than 35 years on death row, Demetrius Frazier was executed by nitrogen hypoxia in Alabama. Let's take a look at the crime he committed. On November 27, 1991, Demetrius broke into the Birmingham apartment of 40-year-old Pauline Brown. Initially, he just wanted money and woke her up demanding cash, but after he forced her to hand over more money, he also actually assaulted her. As soon as Pauline started to plead for her life, Demetrius was done, and he shot her in the back of the head. Before leaving, he searched her apartment for more money, ate some of her food, and got rid of the gun. Her body was found the next day by a concerned friend. The scene was devastating, and no one had any answers. Whoever had done it was gone. But the silence didn't last. A few months later, on March 8, 1992, in Detroit, Demetrius struck again. That day, 14-year-old Crystal Kendrick was found dead inside an abandoned house. The place was gutted, cold, stripped of anything useful, and forgotten by nearly everyone. But that afternoon, Crystal was trapped inside it. She'd run away from home again. And this wasn't the first time. Her life had started falling apart ever since her mother spiraled into addiction and vanished from her world. Friends said Crystal used to be quiet, polite, a good kid. But without anyone steady in her life, she started slipping through the cracks. And that's when she crossed paths with Demetrius Frazier. Inside that abandoned house, Demetrius tried to rape her, but Crystal fought back. She tried to run, but Demetrius pulled a gun and shot her in the head before she could make it to the door. She collapsed on the filthy floor and was gone instantly. Police in Michigan identified him as a suspect almost right away. But at that time, Demetrius was already a wanted man, linked to another brutal case just months earlier. In Alabama, authorities were building a case against him for the rape and murder of Pauline Brown. Then they finally caught up with him, and within hours, the confessions started coming. First, he admitted to killing Crystal. Then he confessed to murdering Pauline too. On February 6, 2025, Demetrius was executed by nitrogen hypoxia at Holman Correctional Facility. His final meal was from Taco Bell and included a beefy 5-layer burrito, a chicken chalupa supreme, beef crunchy tacos, chips and dip, and a Mountain Dew. Before the execution, he met with his mother, sister, and legal counsel. When asked for his final words, he simply said, "Detroit strong. I love everyone on death row. Let's go." At 6:36 p.m., he was officially pronounced dead. Demetrius Terrence Frazier was 52 years old. Just a week later, the next execution was carried out. On February 13, 2025, after spending more than 26 years on death row, James Ford was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But what did he do? On April 6, 1997, James lured his co-worker and his wife, Greg and Kimberly Malnery, to a fish farm in Charlotte County, Florida, under the pretense of a fishing trip. Once they arrived, James attacked them. He shot Greg in the head, then bludgeoned and slit his throat. Kimberly managed to secure their 2-year-old daughter in the backseat of their truck before trying to flee. But James caught her, sexually assaulted her, and then brutally took her life with a rifle. This all happened while her daughter was watching. The following day, farm workers found the couple's bodies, and their daughter was discovered alive in the truck, dehydrated and covered in her mother's blood. She was taken to a hospital and survived. James was arrested almost 2 weeks later, on April 17, 1997, after investigators linked him to the crime. He initially claimed he had left the couple at the farm to go hunting alone, but his story was inconsistent, and multiple witnesses confirmed he was with them before their deaths. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, robbery, sexual battery, and child abuse. In May 1997, prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty, and he was sentenced in February 1999. James tried to appeal the death sentence, but these were denied. His execution was scheduled for February 13th at Florida State Prison. That day, he woke up at 3:30 a.m. and met with 3 family members and his legal team one last time. For his final meal, he requested steak, macaroni and cheese, fried okra, sweet potato, pumpkin pie, and sweet tea. When the warden asked if he had any last words, James didn't say a thing. Strapped to the gurney with around 25 witnesses watching, he stared ahead in silence. But earlier, he had left behind a short handwritten note. Hugs, prayers, love. God bless everyone. At first, as the injection began, his chest began heaving, and then slowly all movements faded. A few minutes later, a staffer shook him and yelled, "Ford! Ford!" to see if he was still conscious. But there was no response. At 6:19 p.m., James was pronounced dead. James Dennis Ford was 64 years old. At that exact moment, another execution was unfolding. A different state, but the same final outcome. Richard Tabler had spent almost 20 years on death row, and the story that led him there was horrifying. For most people, this story starts on Thanksgiving Day in Killeen, Texas. But for Richard Tabler, it began a week earlier, on November 18, 2004. On that day, Richard, who was 25 at the time, had a falling out with his former boss, Mohammed Amina Ramouni, the manager of a local strip club called Teasers. And things escalated fast. Richard claimed Mohammed threatened his family, and that was the last straw. From that moment on, he was planning revenge. Between November 26 and 28, 2004, Richard committed 4 murders in Killeen, Texas. He first shot and killed nightclub manager Mohammed and his friend Hytham Frank Zayed. And 2 days later, he lured 16-year-old Amanda Benefield and 18-year-old Tiffany Dotson to a lake where he shot them multiple times. Richard later called the police to taunt them and threatened further killings if the nightclub was not shut down. Richard was arrested on November 28, 2004, for unrelated charges, but quickly became a suspect in the murders. He confessed while in custody and was charged with capital murder. He was sentenced to death in 2007. On February 14, 2025, just 8 days after his 46th birthday, Richard was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. He wasn't allowed to choose a special last meal and ate off the menu. In his final statement, he addressed the families of his victims, saying, "There is not a day that goes by that I don't regret my actions. I had no right to take your loved ones from you, and I ask and pray, hope and pray, that one day you find it in your hearts to forgive me for those actions. No amount of my apologies will ever return them to you." He also thanked his family, legal team, and prison staff for their support. If you want to read his full statement, I suggest you pause the video here. After apologizing several more times and saying this was the beginning of a new life for him in heaven, he told the warden, "I am finished." As the drugs began to flow, he mouthed once again, "I'm sorry," then began breathing quickly. After about a dozen breaths, all movement stopped. He was pronounced dead at 6:38 p.m. Richard Lee Tabler was 46 years old. On March 7, 2025, after more than 20 years on death row, Brad Keith Sigmon was executed by firing squad. But to understand how he ended up strapped to a chair with a hood over his head, we have to go back, way back. On April 27, 2001, Brad murdered his ex-girlfriend's parents, David and Gladys Lark, in Taylor, South Carolina. After his 3-year relationship with Rebecca Barberi ended, Brad became obsessed, stalking her and trying to win her back. The night before the murders, he consumed alcohol and cocaine, and the next morning, he told a friend he planned to tie up Rebecca's parents and confront her, but his friend backed out. Brad entered the Larks' home alone and attacked them with a baseball bat, repeatedly striking their heads until their skulls were crushed. He then stole a gun and waited for Rebecca to return. When she arrived, Brad forced her into a car at gunpoint. He intended to take her to North Carolina, but she escaped by jumping out and running. Brad fired at her but missed. After she got away, he fled the scene. 11 days later, Brad was captured in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and extradited to South Carolina. The jury sentenced him to death, rejecting his defense's argument that his drug use and emotional distress warranted leniency. His appeals were repeatedly denied, with his final appeal rejected by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2021. Then, on March 7, 2025, the moment finally came. For his final meal, Brad requested 4 pieces of fried chicken from KFC with green beans, mashed potatoes, biscuits, cheesecake, and a sweet tea. He asked for enough to share with other inmates, but reports varied as to whether this request was granted. At 6 p.m., Brad was strapped into the execution chair inside the Broad River Correctional Institution. He said he wanted his final statement to be one of love and a calling to my fellow Christians to help us end the death penalty. An eye for an eye was used as justification to the jury for seeking the death penalty, he said. At that time, I was too ignorant to know how wrong that was. Why? Because we no longer live under the Old Testament law, but now live under the New Testament. He then quoted several Bible passages that emphasize forgiveness and the law. Nowhere does God in the New Testament give man the authority to kill another man, he said. After his final statement, a hood was placed over his head and a target strapped over his heart. He made several heavy breaths during the 2 minutes from when the hood was placed over his head to the shots being fired. The execution was carried out by a firing squad armed with rifles loaded with .308 Winchester rounds, ammunition known for its devastating impact, and they are designed to fragment on contact. A direct hit to the heart could end a life in seconds. The curtains opened at 6:01 p.m., and at 6:05, the trio fired from 15 feet away without any warning. Just before the rifles cracked, some believed he mouthed the words, "I'm okay," to his attorney. Then came the shots. His arms jerked tight the moment the bullets hit, and the paper target snapped clean off his chest. For a second, it looked like he was still breathing, 1, maybe 2 shallow pulls of air, while a dark red bloom spread beneath the wound. His chest shifted slightly. Then, everything went still. About a minute later, a doctor stepped forward, leaned in, and checked for signs of life. 90 seconds passed before he looked up, and at 6:08 p.m., he gave the word. Brad Keith Sigmon was pronounced dead. Brad was 67 years old, the oldest person executed in South Carolina since the death penalty returned. The next execution was scheduled for March 18th. After spending 26 years on death row, Jessie Dean Hoffman Jr. was executed by nitrogen hypoxia in Louisiana, a method never before used in the state. But before we discuss his final moments, let's go back to Thanksgiving morning, November 28, 1996, when a duck hunter made a horrifying discovery in St. Tammany Parish. Lying on a makeshift dock near the Middle Pearl River was the naked body of a young woman who had been shot in the head. Later that day, her husband identified her as Mary Molly Elliott, a 28-year-old advertising executive. He had reported her missing the night before when she never came home from work, and he had spent hours calling, searching, and hoping for any news. But this was the worst possible outcome. That night, police reviewed surveillance footage from a nearby ATM, and they found Mary on camera. She was visibly terrified, and it looked like she was forced to withdraw cash. Standing beside her was an 18-year-old valet who was later identified as Jessie Hoffman. When officers brought him in, he first lied about what happened, and then he changed his story, but eventually he confessed. He said that he had kidnapped Mary at gunpoint, drove her across parish lines, and assaulted her. Then, at the edge of the Middle Pearl River, he made her kneel and shot her in the head. Mary died alone in the cold, and Jessie just went back to work like nothing had happened. On September 11, 1998, the jury found Jessie guilty of first-degree murder, and just 2 days later, they delivered their final decision, a unanimous death sentence. On March 18, 2025, Jesse Dean Hoffman Jr. became the first person in Louisiana executed in over 15 years. Before his execution, he didn't say a word. No final statement, no apology. He also turned down the option of a special last meal, choosing instead to face death without ceremony. Among the witnesses that day was Jesse's wife, Ilona. She had married him while he was already behind bars, standing by him through years of confinement. To her, the system had failed Jesse long before it ever sentenced him to die. As a child, he was left without the safety or guidance every kid deserves. And when he needed help the most, no one showed up. And that silence pushed him down a path where surviving came first and everything else came second. At 6:12 p.m., officers escorted Jesse into the execution chamber. This was Louisiana's first time using nitrogen gas, and the process lasted nearly 19 minutes. Witnesses said Jesse instantly began twitching. His head jerked and his hands clenched, but then fell still. A state official later confirmed the motion, but emphasized that the execution went mostly as expected. He was pronounced dead at 6:50 p.m. Jesse was 46 years old. But not every death row inmate fears the end. Some, like the next man, demand it. On March 19, 2025, after spending 17 years on death row, Aaron Brian Gunches was executed in Arizona. But what did he do? It all started in November 2002, when Mesa police got a tip about a body in the desert. It was Ted Price, shot and dumped under the Arizona sun. But how did he end up there? Days earlier, Ted had been staying at his ex-wife Catherine's place, hoping to get back on his feet. But the peace didn't last. They fought a lot, and eventually she once hit him in the face with a phone. Something in Ted shut down. He didn't fight back. He just stood there, dazed, slow, out of it. And that night, Catherine's new boyfriend, Aaron Gunches, walked through the door. Instead of calling 911 or getting help, Aaron told Catherine and her two roommates to put Ted in the car. He claimed he'd take him to the bus station, get him out of town. Ted sat in the back, silent. They wanted to believe he'd be okay, but they didn't ask questions. At the station, Aaron realized he had no money for a ticket, so he had to come up with a different plan. He told Jennifer to keep driving, farther, out past the city, down a dirt road, empty and dark. Then the shots came fast, 3, then one more. When it was over, Ted was face down in the dust, dead. But the truth unraveled fast. Catherine and her roommates talked, and Aaron was arrested. In 2004, he pled guilty to murdering Ted. He offered no defense, and in 2008, the state gave him death. While most death row inmates spend years fighting to escape execution, Aaron did the opposite. In November 2022, after spending 14 years awaiting execution, he asked the Arizona Supreme Court to issue his execution warrant. He claimed he didn't want delays, saying he wanted justice to be served. Aaron had grown tired of the delays, and once again he demanded to be executed, making it clear that he wanted no more legal obstacles. This time, the state didn't hesitate. The Arizona Supreme Court set March 19th as his official execution date, and there would be no last-minute changes. His final meal consisted of onion rings, a spicy gyro, a barbecue gyro, baklava, and a double Western bacon cheeseburger with fries. He refused to speak any final words. At 53 years old, Aaron Brian Gunches was dead. Just one day later, the next execution was scheduled. On March 20th, 2025, after spending 20 years on death row, Wendell Arden Grissom was executed by lethal injection. But what did he do to end up there? On November 2nd, 2005, Wendell Grissom left Arkansas with a bottle of whiskey and a loaded gun, and somewhere near the Oklahoma line, he picked up a hitchhiker, Jessie Johns, a stranger with no place to go. But by the time they reached Oklahoma City, they weren't just drinking anymore, they were planning. Wendell had a pistol, a spare Derringer, and an idea: robbery. Driving through Blaine County, Wendell spotted a quiet house near Hitchcock and pulled into the driveway. Inside were two women, Lauren Kopf and her best friend Amber Matthews, and Lauren's two small children. Wendell didn't hesitate after they opened the door. He immediately pulled his gun and opened fire. Amber grabbed the baby and tried to run. Lauren fought back, begging Wendell to stop, but instead of listening, he laughed. Then he shot her in the hand, the hip, and the head, then kept shooting. She collapsed, bleeding, but she was alive. But Wendell wasn't done yet. He stalked the house and started shooting at Amber. Somehow Lauren managed to get away, and when she reached the road, she flagged down a passing trucker and gasped, "My friend and my kids are dead." The police rushed to the home and found both children alive. Amber was still breathing when they found her, but she died later at the hospital. Wendell and Jessie were arrested soon after. The trial didn't take long, since the evidence was overwhelming. And in 2006, Wendell Grissom was sentenced to death. Jessie Johns was sentenced to life in prison and remains locked up to this day. Wendell's execution was set for March 20th, 2025. His final meal consisted of a Canadian Bacon Supreme pizza, a pint of vanilla ice cream, and a pint of Coca-Cola. In his final statement, he asked for forgiveness from the family of the woman he murdered. "I apologize to all of you that I've hurt." At 10:13 a.m., Wendell was pronounced dead. He was 56 years old. Just hours later, another man was preparing for his final walk, this time in Florida. On March 20th, 2025, Edward Thomas James was executed by lethal injection after spending nearly 3 decades on death row. But what did he do? On the night of September 19th, 1993, Eddie showed up at a house party just 2 blocks from where he was staying. He drank, laughed, and blended in like nothing was wrong. And by 10:30 p.m., he was clearly drunk. After most of the guests had gone home, he refused a ride and told everyone he was fine. But he wasn't. Before he went home, he used 10 hits of LSD. Then he kept moving, and by the time Eddie walked through Betty Dick's front door, something in him had already turned. Betty was his mother figure and his landlord, and inside the house, she and 4 of her grandchildren were sound asleep. After he stepped inside, he wrapped his hands around Toni Neuner's neck and squeezed. Eventually, he let go, thinking she was dead. He then dragged her to his room, undressed her, assaulted her, and pushed her between the bed and the wall. Toni didn't scream. She never woke up, and she slowly suffocated. But still, Eddie wasn't finished. He burst into Betty's bedroom and hit her with a candlestick. She woke up and screamed, "Why, Eddie, why?" But he kept hitting her. 9-year-old Wendy woke up and ran in, only to see her grandmother being stabbed. When he was done, he took a shower, packed his bags, and stole Betty's purse, jewelry, and car. And by the time police found the bodies, Eddie was gone. For nearly 3 weeks, he stayed on the run until a viewer of America's Most Wanted spotted him in Bakersfield, California. He was arrested on the spot, and on August 18, 1995, Eddie was sentenced to death. On March 20, 2025, inside Florida State Prison, the state carried out his execution. Eddie had no visitors on the last day of his life and gave no final statement. His last meal was fried catfish, potato salad, hush puppies, cookies, soda, and coffee. He died at 8:15 p.m. At 63 years old, Edward Thomas James was pronounced dead. The next execution took place in April. On April 8, 2025, Mikal A. Tanzi was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison after spending more than 25 years on death row. Let's take a look at what he did to end up there. On April 25, 2000, Janet Acosta parked her maroon van at a quiet Japanese garden in Miami. She was on her lunch break, looking for peace. She had a book in her lap, and the window was rolled down, just a moment to herself. But what she didn't know was that Mikal was watching. He was broke, stranded, and angry, desperate for a ride back to Key West. Initially, he asked her for a cigarette, but when she turned to answer him, he punched her in the face and shoved his way into the van. Holding a razor blade, he forced her to drive. South, farther from help, farther from home. By the time they reached Homestead, he had tied her up, stuffed a towel in her mouth, and whispered in her ear that if she screamed, he'd slice her throat. He emptied her wallet, $53, and used it to buy cigarettes and a drink. Then, in a parking lot, he assaulted her with a blade to her throat. By sunset, they reached Blimp Road, a secluded and silent spot, and there he told her that she wasn't going home. He looped a rope around her neck and pulled, and when her gasps grew too loud, he taped her mouth, her nose, and even her eyes. Then he pulled again, harder, until her body stopped moving. But police were already tracking her ATM withdrawals, and just 2 days later, they arrested him as he returned to Janet's van. Eventually, Mikal Tanzi pleaded guilty to every charge, including first-degree murder, and in February 2003, he was sentenced to death. On April 8, 2025, Mikal Tanzi was strapped to a gurney inside Florida State Prison. According to prison officials, he woke up at 4:45 a.m. and had one visitor, a spiritual advisor. For his last meal, Mikal requested a pork chop, bacon, corn, ice cream, and a candy bar. When asked if he had any final words, Mikal spoke in a barely audible voice. He said, "I want to apologize to the family," and then recited a verse from the Bible before the drugs began flowing. Once the 3-drug protocol began, his chest rose and fell for about 3 minutes, then stopped. A corrections officer shook him by the shoulders and called his name twice to check for consciousness. He did not respond. After almost 25 years on death row, Mikal A. Tanzi was pronounced dead at 6:12 p.m. He was 48 years old. 3 days later, the next execution was scheduled, this time in South Carolina. After 18 years on death row, Mikal Mahdi was executed by firing squad. But what did he do? On July 14, 2004, 21-year-old Mikal stole a pistol from his neighbor's home in Virginia. He also took a station wagon and license plates. He was heading south, and he didn't want to be followed. The next night in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, he walked into a convenience store with a can of beer. Behind the counter was 29-year-old Christopher Boggs. When Christopher asked for ID, Mikal pulled the gun and shot him in the face. As Christopher collapsed, Mikal stepped forward and fired again, point blank. Then he walked out, calm, unbothered, and headed south towards South Carolina. And just 3 days later, he struck again. This time, it was a farm outside Columbia. Mikal had already ditched one car and stolen another. He broke into a home and waited, flipping through TV channels, surrounded by tools and weapons, unaware that the land he was hiding on belonged to a police captain. James Myers had spent the day celebrating birthdays with his wife and 5 kids, but when he came home, he walked straight into an ambush. Mikal had grabbed a rifle from the shed and fired. 9 rounds in total, of which 3 hit James in the head, and 1 more tore through his heart. Then Mikal poured diesel on the body and lit it on fire. He stole the captain's truck, his shotgun, and his badge-issued rifle, and drove off like nothing happened. On July 21st, police found him behind the wheel of the stolen truck, and he was arrested. His defense pointed to a broken past, abandonment, mental illness, juvenile institutions. But the jury wasn't swayed. On December 8, 2006, Mikal Mahdi was sentenced to death. On April 11, 2025, Mikal chose a last meal of ribeye steak cooked medium, mushroom risotto, broccoli, collard greens, cheesecake, and sweet tea. Then Mikal was placed in a chair, a target pinned to his chest, and a black cap covering his head at 6:01 p.m. Mikal gave no final statement, didn't speak, and never looked at the witnesses, including his own lawyer, who were seated just feet away. The state's firing squad protocol called for 3 prison staff to fire simultaneously, aiming at a bullseye target on Mahdi's chest. What followed was described by those in the room as both shocking and deeply disturbing. Mahdi let out a sharp yell that cut through the silence. One witness said it felt like a deep heave, as if his chest expanded hard, then collapsed. His arms flexed, and he groaned twice, about 45 seconds after the bullets hit. Witnesses reported that he continued to breathe for another 80 seconds, taking what appeared to be a final gasp before going still. A prison doctor stepped forward and pronounced him dead at 6:05 p.m., less than 4 minutes after he was shot. At 42 years old, Mikal Dean Mahdi was dead. By the time he died, Mikal had spent 68% of his life either in juvenile or adult prison. The next execution was scheduled 12 days later, this time in Texas. Let's take a look. On April 23, 2025, after spending more than 20 years on death row, Moises Sandoval Mendoza was executed by lethal injection in Texas. But before we discuss his final moments, let's go back to where it all began. On March 18, 2004, 20-year-old Rachel Tollison wasn't answering her door. Her purse was still on the table, her car was parked outside, but her house was a wreck, and her 5-month-old baby was found crying alone on a flipped-over bed. But Rachel was gone. Her mother had stopped by like she always did, but this time there was no sign of Rachel. And then, 6 days later, a hiker found something in the woods, a pile of logs, and beneath them, Rachel's body. She'd been strangled, stabbed, and eventually set on fire. Detectives looked at her estranged husband first. They had a messy divorce, and he had been at a bonfire the night she disappeared. The same mesquite wood burned at that party matched the logs found with her body, right down to the chemical trace. But then a new name surfaced, Moises Mendoza. He was the one who brought the firewood, and he knew Rachel from high school. They spoke at the party, but she wasn't interested in him. When questioned, he told the police that she left with him willingly. But no one believed that. Later, his story changed. He admitted he choked her in his truck, assaulted her in a field, strangled her once, then again and again. When he thought she was dead, he stabbed her in the throat to make sure. But as the police closed in, he panicked. He dragged her body to a remote pit in Collin County, lit her on fire, and buried what was left beneath a brush pile. He thought no one would ever find her. At trial, there was no debate about guilt, and it took the jury just 4 hours to come up with a sentence. On July 3, 2005, Moises Mendoza was sentenced to death. On April 23, 2025, after spending over 2 decades on death row, Moises was finally executed. He wasn't allowed to choose a last meal. Texas removed that option in 2011 after 2 inmates ordered a massive feast and refused to eat it. Now they receive the same food as everyone else. After he was strapped to the gurney, his spiritual advisor prayed over him for about 2 minutes. Then Moises turned to the victim's family. One by one, he addressed them by name. Rachel's parents, her 2 brothers, her cousin, and her uncle, all watching through a window from the adjoining room. "I am sorry for having robbed you of Rachel's life," he said. He also said he had robbed Rachel's daughter of her mother, adding, "I'm sorry for that. I know nothing I could ever say or do would ever make up for it. I want you to know that I am sincere. I apologize." Her daughter wasn't present, but his words were directed to her anyway. Then, turning toward another window, he spoke in Spanish to his wife, sister, and 2 friends who sat watching. "I love you, I am with you, I am well and at peace," he said. "You know that I'm well, and everything is love." At 6:21 p.m., the drugs began to flow. Moises let out 2 loud gasps, then began to snore. After about 10 snores, his body fell still. He was pronounced dead at 6:40 p.m. At 41 years old, Moises Sandoval Mendoza was dead. Just 1 day later, James Osgood was executed by lethal injection after spending more than a decade on death row. But to understand how James ended up on death row in the first place, we need to go back to October 2010, when everything started. On October 13, 2010, Tracy Brown didn't show up for work, and when calls and texts went unanswered, her boss asked for a welfare check. Her landlord opened the door and immediately froze. Tracy was lying naked on the bedroom floor, her throat slit so deep it left no doubt. This wasn't a suicide. It was a brutal, deliberate murder. Detectives quickly pieced together her final day. Tracy had spent it with 2 people, her cousin, Tanya Van Dyke, and Tanya's boyfriend, James Osgood. A gun was found in their home, and James admitted it was theirs. Later, detectives noticed a fresh cut on his finger, consistent with knife injuries from stab wounds. Eventually, James broke. He said that he and Tanya had fantasized about violence. They watched crime shows and talked about torturing someone. At first, they imagined a stranger, but instead, they chose someone they knew. They chose Tracy. James choked her from behind. Then they dragged her to the bedroom. Here, James forced Tracy to perform acts while Tanya held a gun. And when Tracy tried to run, James dragged her back by her hair. Then he pulled a knife from his sock, slashed her throat, and stabbed her in the back. He then just kept cutting her, and as she bled out, he whispered, "It's nothing against you. Just stop fighting. Let go." Tanya took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty in order to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to life in prison instead. She remains incarcerated to this day. James was charged with 2 counts of capital murder, one for On June 13, 2014, the jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death. On Thursday, April 24, 2025, his final day came. He ate breakfast and snacks, but refused lunch. For his final meal, he requested pizza. At 6:09 p.m., the curtain to the execution viewing room opened. James was already strapped to the gurney. At 6:11, he spoke his final words. "I have not said her name since that day. Tracy, I apologize." Then he turned to the people watching, his loved ones, and offered them quiet gestures. At 6:12, he sat upright and made hand signs, 143, code for "I love you." At 6:15, he laid his head down. He took slow, deep breaths as the drugs entered his system. And just moments later, a guard performed the routine consciousness check, calling his name, pinching his arm, flicking his eyelid. James did not respond. By 6:18, his breathing stopped, and at 6:35 p.m., James Osgood was pronounced dead. He was 55 years old. The next execution took place in May. On May 1, 2025, after spending more than 20 years on death row, Jeffrey Glen Hutchinson was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But what did he do? On the night of September 11, 1998, in a quiet neighborhood in Crestview, Florida, 4 lives were wiped out in just minutes. Inside a modest home, a woman and her 3 children were shot in the head, execution style. There was no struggle, no warning, and no mercy. And the killer wasn't a stranger. It was Jeffrey Hutchinson, a former Army Ranger Gulf War veteran, and the man who lived with them. He was Renee Flaherty's boyfriend, the same guy who helped her raise her kids, Jeffrey, Amanda, and Logan. They trusted him, and then one night he murdered them. Earlier that evening, nothing seemed off, until Jeffrey and Renee got into a fight, a bad one. Afterward, Jeffrey had packed some things, grabbed his guns, and left. Renee thought it was over, but it wasn't. Jeffrey went to a nearby bar and started drinking, ranting to the bartender about needing to cool off. But instead, he got back in his truck with his shotgun beside him and drove home. He shot Renee first, one round to the head. Then he moved through the house like a soldier clearing rooms, and he killed everyone inside. Then, like it was routine, Jeffrey called 911.
911, what's your emergency?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am?
Yes.
I just shot my family.
Okay, sir, stay in line with Big Boy.
Ma'am, I love my family.
I just shot my family, he said, and he was arrested on the scene. At trial, the jury didn't see a man broken by war. They saw a man who picked up a gun and killed the people who loved him. And in 2001, they found him guilty of all 4 murders and sentenced him to death. Jeffrey's execution was scheduled for May 1st, 2025. For his final meal, he requested salmon, mahi-mahi, asparagus, baked potato, and iced tea. He had 3 visitors that day, including his sister and a spiritual advisor. That evening, he was led into the death chamber and strapped to the gurney. When asked if he had any final words, he said nothing. But as the process began, witnesses saw his lips move, soft, almost inaudible, as if he were talking to himself or whispering a prayer. The state chose lethal injection as the method to execute him. His legs shook sporadically, and he seemed to have body spasms for several minutes before falling still. The process took a little more than 15 minutes. He was declared dead at 8:15 p.m. Jeffrey Hutchinson was 62 years old. 2 weeks later, the next scheduled execution drew far more attention. This time, it was in Florida, and the man at the center of it was serial killer Glen Rogers. Known as the Casanova Killer or the cross-country killer, Glen targeted women who trusted him, mostly redheads like his mother. His first victim was 71-year-old Mark Peters in Ohio, an elderly man who offered him a place to stay when no one else did, but ended up bound and left to rot in a Kentucky cabin. Then it went fast. He first targeted Sandra Gallagher, a mother of 3 in California. She was strangled and set on fire in her truck. His next victim was Linda Price in Mississippi, who was found stabbed to death and left in a blood-smeared bathtub. Then came Tina Marie Cribbs in Florida. She was found dead in a motel room after offering Glen a ride. And eventually, Andy Sutton in Louisiana, butchered in her own bedroom after inviting him back into her life. Each murder was personal, brutal, and calculated. And by the time Glen was caught, he was likely already on his way to kill again. He thought he was careful by moving states after each murder. But his trail was longer and bloodier than he realized, and eventually states started talking to each other. By late 1995, America's Most Wanted aired his face. Papers ran his photo nationwide, and detectives began showing up at carnivals, asking workers if they'd seen him. And on November 9th, his run was over. In 1997, he stood trial for Tina Marie Cribbs' murder in Florida, and the jury sentenced him to death. 2 years later, California convicted him for the murder of Sandra Gallagher, and here he received another death sentence. With that, Glen Rogers became one of the rare inmates facing execution in 2 different states. But Glen had more to say. He said he was the one who killed Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, and that O.J. Simpson had hired him to do it. But no one believed him. On May 15, 2025, after spending 28 years on death row, Glen Rogers was executed. That morning, Glen woke up at 3:45 a.m. For his final meal, he requested a pizza, chocolate cake, and a soda. He also had one last visit from his wife. I have looked into this, but further details about his wife and their relationship aren't available in any public records. Later that day, he was strapped to the gurney. When asked for any last words, Glen looked toward the witnesses and spoke directly to those he loved: his wife, his brothers, his sons, his grandchildren, and a close friend who had helped with his final appeals. Then, turning to the victims' families, he said, "I know there's a lot of questions that you need answers to. I promise you in the near future the questions will be answered, and I hope in some way will bring you closure," he said. "President Trump, keep making America great. I'm ready to go." Then the drugs began to flow. Glen lay still as the lethal injection started. Within 2 minutes, his eyes closed and his mouth fell open. As the process continued, his face slowly turned pale. At one point, a staff member grasped him by the shoulders, shook him, and yelled, "Rogers, Rogers," checking for any sign of consciousness. There was none. Glen Rogers was pronounced dead at 6:16 p.m. He was 62 years old. Just 5 days later, another execution followed, this time in Indiana. After nearly 23 years on death row, Benjamin Donnie Ritchie faced the same fate. But to understand what got him on death row in the first place, we need to go back to where it all started. On September 29, 2000, in Beech Grove, Indiana, a white van was reported stolen from a gas station. Not long after, Officer Matthew Hickey spotted it cruising past the scene of a traffic stop with 3 men inside. And just like that, the chase began. 2 more officers joined in, Robert Mercury and William Bill Toney, and the van didn't get far. It crashed into a yard and the doors flew open. One suspect was caught immediately. The second, 20-year-old Benjamin Ritchie, ran. Bill immediately chased him across backyards, fences, and swing sets until Benjamin turned, pulled a 9mm Glock, and fired 5 shots. 1 bullet hit Bill above his vest. He fired back once, then collapsed in the grass. He died there in that backyard, just 1 day before his 32nd birthday. After the shooting, Benjamin vanished. He tossed the gun and a wig into a nearby brush and slipped past the perimeter. And by the time officers locked the area down, he was already hiding in a friend's home. Then, an anonymous tip came in. Officers surrounded the house and found Benjamin inside. This time, he didn't run. He didn't speak. And he didn't resist. He was arrested on the spot, along with Michael Moody, the 3rd man from the van. On August 14th, the jury came back with their decision. After just 3 hours of deliberation, the verdict was unanimous. Benjamin would be sentenced to death. Indiana's death row is a little different. As you can see here, Benjamin had a real cat walking inside his cell. And that's not a figure of speech. Death row inmates in Indiana are actually allowed to keep cats as pets. Why? It's part of a program aimed at reducing isolation and improving behavior. And then came the date, May 20th, 2025, nearly 23 years after he first entered death row. At 44 years old, Benjamin Donnie Ritchie was executed by lethal injection in Indiana. For his last meal, Benjamin chose the tour of Italy from Olive Garden, a plate of chicken parmigiana, lasagna, and fettuccine alfredo. Just after midnight, the execution process began. His final words were simple: "I love my family, my friends, and all the support I've gotten. I hope they all find peace." At 12:46 a.m., Benjamin was pronounced dead. On the same day, May 20th, 2025, Matthew Lee Johnson was executed by lethal injection, exactly 13 years after he committed a brutal crime. But what did he do to end up on death row? On the morning of May 20th, 2012, Matthew walked into the Whip-In convenience store in Garland, Texas, carrying a plastic bottle of lighter fluid and a cigarette lighter in his pocket. He walked straight past the snacks and sodas toward the register, where 76-year-old clerk Nancy Harris told him he wasn't allowed back there. But Matthew didn't stop. He poured the fluid over her head and demanded cash. He took cigarettes, grabbed what little money was in the drawer, and even stole her ring. Then, with nothing left to gain, he flicked the lighter. The flame caught instantly, and Nancy's clothes ignited. But Matthew didn't try to help. He walked out calm, even stopped to grab a piece of candy near the door. Then he disappeared, while Nancy was burning alive. When she made it outside, her whole body was engulfed. 2 nearby officers saw the smoke and rushed in. One grabbed a fire extinguisher and sprayed her down, while the other tried to keep her talking. In a whisper, Nancy gave them everything she could: what happened, who did it, and what he looked like. Despite severe burns over nearly half her body, Nancy survived long enough to tell paramedics she didn't want to keep fighting. Her living will was honored, and 5 days later, she died in the hospital. Matthew had been arrested just hours after the attack. He was found with her ring and stolen cash still in his pockets. He confessed immediately, claiming he only meant to scare her. But no one believed it, and the surveillance footage was clear. The fire, the robbery, the walkout, there was no panic, no hesitation. At trial, Matthew didn't deny it. He told the jury he was scum, said he deserved to be set on fire like Nancy, but then he asked them not to kill him, not for his sake, but for his daughters. He said he didn't want them growing up knowing their father had been executed. The jury listened and still sentenced him to death, because by then they knew this wasn't a one-time mistake. It was the final chapter in a long history of violence. And then came the date, May 20th, 2025, exactly 13 years to the day since Nancy Harris was set on fire. Under Texas law, inmates can no longer request a special last meal, so Matthew was served the same standard tray as everyone else. When asked if he had any last words, Matthew turned to the victim's family and spoke. "To Mrs. Harris's family, as I look at each and every one of you, I see her on that day," he said. "I just please ask for y'all's forgiveness. I never meant to hurt her. I pray that she's the first person that I see when I open my eyes, and I will spend eternity with her." He continued, praised God, and thanked him for the life he has given me. Then he addressed the men he had spent years with on death row, calling them brothers, and told them he loved them. He also thanked the prison staff for treating him with dignity, for giving him, in his words, the opportunity to get in right standings with my Lord. Then came his apology to his wife and daughters. "Just know that it's nothing that y'all did. I made wrong choices, I've made wrong decisions, and now I pay the consequences." He ended with a prayer of gratitude. "I thank the Lord for the last 13 years. He has given me the opportunity to ask for his forgiveness, and I thank him for his redemption," he said. "Welcome me, Father. Thank each and every one of you for being here. I'm done, Warden." Matthew received a lethal injection shortly after 6 p.m. inside the Huntsville unit. He gasped several times, then began making low, snoring-like sounds. Within a minute, all movement stopped. He was pronounced dead at 6:53 p.m. Matthew Lee Johnson was 49 years old. The next execution was set for just 2 days later, this time in Tennessee. On May 22, 2025, after almost 35 years on death row, Oscar Franklin Smith was executed by lethal injection in Tennessee. Let's go back and look at how this case unfolded. It was just after 11:20 p.m. on October 1, 1989, when a terrified 911 call came into Nashville Dispatch. "Help me," pleaded Jason Burnett. In the background, his brother screamed, "Frank, no! God, help me!" Then came silence. Jason managed to get out one last thing: 324 Luty Street. And then the line went dead. Officers responded within minutes, but when no one answered the door and nothing seemed out of place, they left. But inside, the horror waited. The next afternoon, police returned after a neighbor called in. This time, they went inside and found 3 bodies: Judy Smith and her sons, Chad and Jason. Blood soaked the kitchen and the furniture was overturned. Chad had been shot 3 times and stabbed repeatedly. Judy had been shot, stabbed, and slashed. Jason hadn't been shot, but he was stabbed so violently his internal organs were exposed. All 3 had fought for their lives, but none of them made it. There was no sign of forced entry, but the back door was open. Bullet holes marked the walls. A .22 caliber casing was found near the den, and blood trails stretched from room to room. The gun and knife were gone, but one weapon had been left behind, a blood-covered awl. And then there was the print. A palm mark in blood pressed into the bedsheet beside Judy's body. What stood out wasn't just the blood, it was what was missing: 2 fingers. Just like Oscar Franklin Smith, Judy's estranged husband. a man who'd lost those fingers years earlier in an accident. And suddenly, everything pointed to him. The motive, the history, and now, a signature left in blood. On July 26, 1990, Oscar Franklin Smith was found guilty of capital murder, and 2 days later, they sentenced him to death. Frank's first execution date was set for December 3, 1990, just 5 months after his death sentence. But the appeals came fast, and everything was put on hold. For more than 3 decades, he stayed on death row while his legal team fought to overturn the case. They challenged evidence, filed motions, and pleaded for more time. But none of it worked. In 2022, Tennessee gave him a new date, April 21st. For what he believed would be his last meal, he ordered a double bacon cheeseburger, deep dish apple pie, and vanilla bean ice cream. But just hours before the injection, Governor Bill Lee issued a surprise reprieve. The execution was called off after officials discovered the drugs hadn't been properly tested for endotoxins. That mistake halted every execution in the state for the rest of the year. Tennessee's Department of Corrections spent the next 2 years overhauling the protocol. For the 4th time in 35 years, Frank faced the clock again. His new date, May 22, 2025. And just like before, he was allowed to request a final meal. This time, he asked for hot dogs, tater tots, and apple pie with vanilla ice cream. On the morning of his execution, Frank lay strapped to the gurney, his hands still and eyes open. His spiritual advisor stood nearby, softly praying and singing the hymn, "I'll Fly Away." At 10:32 a.m., the curtain separating the execution chamber from the witness room was drawn back. In those final moments, Frank spoke quietly with the advisor. "I didn't kill her," he said. 2 IV lines had been placed in Frank's right arm. When asked for his final words, he took his time, speaking for nearly 3 minutes. "Somebody needs to tell the governor the justice system doesn't work," he said. "He's the last word, the last person to give justice where justice is needed. Too many innocent people are being killed." His tone hardened. "He needs to quit, get a backbone," he said. "Our justice system is broken, and he has the power to stop this." He looked out toward the witnesses. "We have more men waiting to die at Riverbend. I won't be the first, and I won't be the last." As the pentobarbital began flowing through the IV lines, Frank kept speaking, but his voice grew weaker. By 10:38 a.m., he was struggling to form words, then stopped speaking altogether. His stomach was rising and falling slowly, and it looked like he fell asleep. At 10:47 a.m., he was declared dead. Oscar Franklin Smith was 75 years old. The next execution took place in June. On June 10, 2025, after more than 30 years on death row, Anthony Floyd Wainwright was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But what did he do to end up on death row? It all started on April 27, 1994, when Carmen Gayhart didn't show up to pick up her 2 kids from daycare. She was 23 years old, a nursing student in Lake City, Florida, and a mother of 2 young children aged 5 and 3. But that afternoon, she disappeared without a trace. Just 2 days before Carmen vanished, Anthony Wainwright and Richard Hamilton broke out of a minimum security prison in North Carolina. One was doing time for burglary, the other for armed robbery. But they weren't interested in finishing their sentences. They stole a Cadillac, broke into a home, grabbed 2 rifles, and headed south toward Florida, armed, reckless, and already on the edge of violence. In Lake City, their stolen car gave out, overheated and useless. That's when they saw Carmen, 23 years old, loading groceries into her Bronco in a Winn-Dixie parking lot. They pulled a gun and forced her into the vehicle. Hours later, deep in the woods behind a truck stop, both men raped her. And afterward, Anthony strangled her with his bare hands, then shot her twice in the head. Insurance, in his words. They left her in the dirt like she was nothing and drove off in her car. The next day, a state trooper spotted the Bronco in Mississippi. In custody, they talked, but both blamed the other one for the killing. But where was the body? Eventually, Richard drew a map to the location where they dumped the body, and on May 2nd, deputies found Carmen's body, decomposed, discarded, and buried under brush. Her hyoid bone was broken, and her teeth were scattered in the dirt. It confirmed what investigators already feared. Carmen had fought for her life and lost. Back in Florida, prosecutors offered Anthony a deal, no death penalty if he told the full truth and passed a polygraph. But after 2 weeks of interviews, he finally admitted to the and refused the test. Then came the DNA results. His fluid was found in Carmen's car. The deal was gone. In May 1995, both men were convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. 2 juries, 2 death sentences, and not once did either of them show remorse. Then, on January 13, 2023, the case quietly closed for one of them. Richard Hamilton died in prison of natural causes at the age of 59. The official cause of death was never made public, but after nearly 30 years on death row, his time ran out before the state ever carried out the sentence. Then, after spending more than 30 years on death row, Anthony's final day came. On the morning of June 10, 2025, he woke up around 3:30 a.m. inside Florida State Prison. Officials offered him a last meal, but he politely declined. According to the Reverend, Anthony was very afraid of what was coming. While strapped to the gurney, he was asked if he had any final words. Anthony turned to the victim's family first. "I hope my death brings you peace and healing," he said. But then his tone shifted. He called his court-appointed attorney Florida's worst and said the justice system in the state was broken beyond repair. "Please continue the fight," he told those opposing the death penalty, "because I can promise you they are not going to let up. They will continue to murder if we continue to let it happen." Most of his final words, though, were for his fiancée Samantha, the woman who had taken his last name, even though they were never legally married. "You are the love of my life. I'm so blessed we found each other," he told her. "The years we have spent together have been beyond wonderful. They have been downright magical. Love is stronger than death, and I know our love will last for eternity." The drugs started flowing at 6:10 p.m. Anthony's shoulders shuddered once, then again. He blinked hard, pulled in a few sharp breaths, then stopped moving altogether. By 6:14, he lay completely still. At 6:22 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Anthony Floyd Wainwright was 54 years old. At that exact moment, another execution was unfolding in Alabama. A different state, a different method, but the same final outcome. Gregory Hunt had spent almost 30 years on death row, and the story that led him to die by nitrogen gas was just as haunting. In the early morning hours of August 2nd, 1988, paramedics stepped into a small apartment in Cordova, Alabama, and into a scene that stopped them cold. Karen Lane, just 29 years old, lay dead on the kitchen floor, beaten, broken, and violated. Her injuries were catastrophic. She suffered 60 separate wounds, her ribs were shattered, her liver was torn, she had a ruptured aorta, and there was a broken broomstick lying between her legs. From the moment officers saw the scene, they knew this wasn't random. The man responsible was Gregory Hunt, Karen's boyfriend of only a few weeks. In the days leading up to the murder, his jealousy had turned volatile. He stalked her, threatened her, and even lit her vacant house on fire the night before. That night, he called her roommate with a chilling message. "Karen's lying here on the kitchen floor. Someone should get her to a hospital." And by the time police arrived, she was already gone. Greg fled, but when his sister asked him directly, "Did you kill her?" Greg answered without hesitation, "Yes." He blamed the drugs, the alcohol, and the anger. He said he snapped, but the evidence didn't waver. His bloody palm print was on the wall, his DNA was in her mouth, and his fingerprints were everywhere. On June 19, 1990, a jury convicted him on 3 counts of capital murder, for killing her during a burglary, during a sexual assault, and for taking the life of someone who couldn't legally consent. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it didn't need to be. 11-1 was enough to send Gregory to death row. Gregory Hunt's final day came on June 10, 2025. He skipped a last dinner meal the night before, but for lunch he chose a tray of bologna, black-eyed peas, carrots, and fruit punch. When the curtain pulled back at 5:52 p.m., Gregory lay strapped to the gurney, wrapped in a white sheet with a mask over his face. After the death warrant was read, Greg declined to say any final words, but did give a thumbs up and what appeared to be a peace sign. But not long before that moment, in a phone call, he had spoken plainly. At first, he insisted he wasn't your typical death row inmate. Then he said 6 words that stuck. "I don't have no pity party." He paused, then added, "You know, I'm just battling until I get a break, or they snuff my light out." When asked about the crime itself, his voice changed. "I can't explain what happened," he said quietly. "All I can say is that she didn't deserve what happened to her." On the night of June 10th, the gas started flowing sometime after 5:55 p.m. At 5:57, Greg briefly shook, gasped, and raised his head off the gurney. He let out a moan at about 5:59 p.m. and raised his feet. Then he took a series of 4 or more gasping breaths with long pauses in between. And by 6:05 p.m., he stopped moving altogether. His left fist remained clenched long afterward. Gregory Hunt was pronounced dead at 6:26 p.m. Gregory Hunt was 65 years old. Just 2 days later, the next inmate was strapped to the gurney, this time in Oklahoma. More than 25 years after he committed a brutal crime, George John Hanson was executed by lethal injection. Let's take a look at what he did. On the evening of August 31, 1999, 77-year-old Mary Bowles was just trying to load her car outside Tulsa Promenade Mall. A retired banker and longtime hospital volunteer, she had no idea 2 armed men were watching her, waiting. Their names were George John Hanson, also known as John Fitzgerald Hanson, and Victor Miller, and by that point, they had already robbed 2 liquor stores and now needed a clean vehicle to keep going. Victor took the wheel while John forced Mary into the backseat at gunpoint. They headed north into the dark, pulling off the road near Owasso and into a dirt pit. But someone was already there, Gerald Thurman, a trucking company owner. Victor shot Gerald 4 times and left him bleeding on the ground. The 2 men kept driving with Mary still in the car. Somewhere along a quiet rural road, they pulled over, dragged her out, and John shot her multiple times. Her body was left beneath a pile of branches. Gerald was found first, still alive, but he died 2 weeks later without regaining consciousness. Mary's body wasn't discovered until a week after the shooting. In the meantime, John and Victor kept moving, using her car to check into a motel, robbing stores, and staying 1 step ahead, until Victor's wife tipped off the police. Officers arrested them at an Econo Lodge in Muskogee, finding the murder weapons hidden in the toilet tank. Forensics confirmed their prints in Mary's car, and a witness, John's friend, testified that John had bragged about the killings. Both men were charged with 2 counts of murder and federal robbery. John went to trial in May 2001. The jury found him guilty and recommended death for Mary's murder and life without parole for Gerald's. He was transferred to federal prison to serve his robbery sentence while awaiting execution. Victor's trial came next. He had already served time for murder before, but this time the evidence was overwhelming. Like John, he received death for Mary and life for Gerald. But Victor appealed his death penalty successfully, and he was sentenced to life instead. He remains in prison to this day. At his clemency hearing on May 7th, John tried to explain himself. Speaking through a video link, his voice low but steady, John expressed remorse for his involvement in the crimes and apologized to the victims' families. "I'm not an evil person," he said. "I was caught in a situation I couldn't control. I can't change the past, but I would if I could." However, during that hearing, clemency was denied, and the execution date remained in place. John didn't request anything special for his final meal. No favorites, no last indulgences. Just the standard tray handed out that Wednesday evening, which was chicken pot pie, 2 rolls, 2 fruit cups, and carrots. ordinary food on an extraordinary night. Then his final morning came. On June 12, 2025, John was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Strapped to the gurney, John spoke his last words. "Just forgive me and peace to everyone." The execution began at 10:01 a.m. After the drugs began to flow, a doctor entered the death chamber at 10:06 a.m. and declared him unconscious. The process was smooth without any reported complications. He was pronounced dead at 10:11 a.m. George John Hanson was 61 years old. Just one day later, after spending almost 20 years on death row, Stephen Stanko was executed by lethal injection in South Carolina. But before we talk about his final moments, let's look at what got him on death row in the first place. Stephen Stanko knew how to present himself. On the surface, he looked like a man rebuilding his life, a thoughtful, well-spoken ex-con with a book under his belt and a story to tell. But that book was born out of a decade-long sentence for assault and kidnapping handed down in 1996, of which he served nearly 9 years. After getting out of prison in 2004, Stephen Stanko settled in Myrtle Beach. He told people he wanted a fresh start, but something darker was brewing. He spent long hours at the public library under the pretense of writing a book about serial killers. There, he charmed a librarian named Laura Ling. She invited him into her home, where she lived with her 15-year-old daughter. But on April 7, 2005, that trust shattered. Stephen claimed an argument spiraled out of control, but what followed was a calculated attack. He tied Laura up and beat her, then assaulted her daughter. When the girl woke up, dazed and bloodied, she saw Stephen strangle her mother. But when she tried to stop him, he slit her throat and walked away, believing she was dead. But she survived. She dialed 911 and gave police just enough time to start hunting. At the same time, Stephen had already driven to Conway, where he manipulated 74-year-old Henry Turner into letting him stay the night. The next morning, Stephen walked toward him with a gun and shot him, beat him, and fired again. After killing Henry, Stephen drained his bank account and used the money to bar hop in Columbia, laughing and buying drinks. By the time he reached Augusta, Georgia, he was pretending to be a wealthy businessman in town for the Masters Golf Tournament. But on April 12th, the woman he was staying with saw his face in the paper, and she called the police. Hours later, Stephen was arrested without a fight. Inside his home, investigators found articles on Jeffrey Dahmer, Gary Ridgway, and other serial killers, clear signs that he'd been studying them. In 2006, he stood trial for Laura's murder and was sentenced to death, and he got 110 more years for the assault and attempted murder of her daughter. In 2009, he was convicted again for killing Henry and handed another death sentence. On Friday, June 13, 2025, Stephen's time ran out. He ate fried fish, fried shrimp, crab cakes, a baked potato, carrots, fried okra, cherry pie, banana pudding, and sweet tea. On his final evening, he was strapped to the gurney with one arm outstretched, where medical staff inserted an IV line to administer the lethal drug. The execution began after Stephen's attorneys read a 3.5-minute final statement. In it, Stephen apologized to his victims and asked not to be judged by the worst day of his life. "I am truly sorry for the pain and loss that I caused in this horrible situation. Sorry is never enough, but that does not mean it should not be said." He also talked about how he was an honor student and athlete and a volunteer, and asked several times not to be judged by the night he killed 2 people. "I have lived for approximately 20,973 days, but I am judged solely for 1. He once again apologized to his victims and their families. "Once I am gone, I hope that Christina, Laura's family, and Henry's family can all forgive me. The execution may help them. Forgiveness will heal them." When the signal came, the prison officials asked for the first dose of the sedative pentobarbital. Stephen moved his lips, appearing to be saying words, and turned toward the families of the victims. He then let out several quick breaths as his lips quivered. He appeared to stop breathing after a minute. A prison employee asked for a second dose of pentobarbital about 13 minutes later. Stephen was pronounced dead at 6:34 p.m. Stephen Christopher Stanko was 57 years old. 11 days later, the next execution was scheduled. On June 24, 2025, after more than 30 years on death row, Thomas Lee Gudinas was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But before we talk about his final moments, let's look at what got him on death row in the first place. On May 23, 1994, Thomas vanished into the night after bar hopping through Orlando with friends. But while his roommates wrapped up their evening at Barbarella's nightclub, Thomas disappeared. Around 2 a.m., 22-year-old Michelle McGrath left the same club to get her car, but she never made it. Her fiancé searched, but the lot was silent. The next morning, a school staffer found her body crumpled behind a brick wall near the Pace School, naked, lifeless, and discarded like trash. At nearly the same time, a man flagged down a cop nearby to report a strange pile of clothing beside a red Geo Metro. But by then, Thomas had already fled the scene, driving off in Michelle's stolen car. Another woman, Rochelle Smith, had narrowly escaped a similar attack at the same club just an hour before Michelle. When she saw news of the killing, she went straight to police and identified Thomas from a photo lineup. Another witness did the same, and Thomas's roommates, horrified by what they saw when he came home, bloodied with raw knuckles and torn-up hands, told detectives everything. Then came the forensic evidence. His DNA on Michelle's body, his fingerprints on the car and alley gate, and his own words, cold, explicit confessions of and The jury didn't hesitate, and in June 1995, Thomas was sentenced to death. He also received multiple life sentences. Florida made it official. He would never walk free again. On June 24, 2025, his final day came. That morning, Thomas woke up at 4:45 a.m. alone with his thoughts. He had just one visitor that day, his mother. No spiritual advisor, no final prayers, just silence and the slow ticking of time. For his last meal, Thomas requested a pepperoni pizza, fries, and a soda. When the curtain to the execution room opened at 6 p.m., Thomas already lay strapped to a gurney with an IV in his left arm, wearing a plain white shirt and dark pants. From a distance, he looked calm, with healthy color in his skin and no visible signs of fear or pain. When the curtain rose, Thomas was already scanning the witness room, his eyes moving slowly and his head turning just slightly. There was no spiritual advisor at his side. The warden finished his call with the governor's office and leaned in. He asked if Thomas had any final words. The microphone was too far away, and the hum of the air conditioning was too loud, so no one in the witness chamber could make out what he said. But a prison spokesman later shared that Thomas had made a quiet repentance and mentioned the name of Jesus. However, his exact words have not yet been released. When the drugs began to flow, Thomas's eyes began to roll back and his breathing shortened. After several minutes, he lost color in his face and fell still. He appeared unconscious. The usual checks followed. A guard leaned in, called his name, and flicked at his eyelid. But no response came. The signal was given, and then came the next 2 doses. After this, the prison warden announced that the sentence had been carried out. The curtain to the execution chamber closed, and witnesses were escorted out. At 6:13 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Thomas Lee Gudinas was 51 years old. Just 1 day later, the final execution for June 2025 was carried out, this time in Mississippi. On June 25, 2025, after spending almost 50 years on death row, Richard Gerald Jordan was executed by lethal injection in Mississippi. Let's look at what he did. On the morning of January 12, 1976, Edwina Martyr kissed her kids goodbye and stepped into the last day of her life. As her killer, 29-year-old Richard, was already circling. He was a broke and desperate veteran, and he had picked her family at random. He dialed her husband's bank to get a name, hunted down their address and showed up at her door pretending to be a utility worker. Edwina let him in while her toddler slept in the other room. He pulled a gun and forced her to leave her son behind, then drove her into the forest, where he shot her in the back of the head and left her body under the trees. But just hours later, he called her husband to demand a $25,000 ransom, pretending she was still alive. What followed was a string of lies, fake drop-offs, and phone calls where Richard calmly claimed Edwina was asking about her children, but she was already gone. After collecting the ransom from a decoy drop, he tried to flee, but didn't get far. Police caught him at a roadblock, and he confessed everything. The weapon, the car, the body, he gave it all up. But what should have ended there didn't. Instead, Richard's case dragged on for decades. 4 times he was sentenced to death, and 3 times that sentence was overturned. At one point, he accepted a deal for life without parole, only for the courts to rule that that wasn't legal when the crime occurred. And that was it. This time, the sentence stood. But even then, it would take another 27 years before it was carried out. For decades, Richard sat in a cell while the world outside changed. He grew old behind those walls and became the oldest, longest-serving death row inmate Mississippi had ever seen. But time didn't stop for him. He wrote short stories, took on prison jobs, and lived long enough to see the state's execution method change from gas chamber to lethal injection. But none of it changed what was coming. The sentence had been signed, the date set, and the final steps were already underway. On June 25, 2025, after spending nearly 50 years on death row, Richard's final day came. The Mississippi Department of Corrections allowed his loved ones to stay with him until 4 p.m., the cutoff before the preparations began. That's when he was offered his final meal, for which he requested chicken tenders, fries, strawberry ice cream, and a root beer float. At 6 p.m., Richard was strapped to the gurney. The room was still. Observers sat behind the glass as staff moved through the final steps. Richard's wife, Marcia, witnessed the execution, along with his lawyer and a spiritual advisor. His wife and lawyer dabbed their eyes several times. When asked if he had any last words, Richard spoke clearly. "First, I would like to thank everyone for a humane way of doing this. I want to apologize to the victim's family." He also thanked his lawyers and his wife and asked for forgiveness. His last words just before the drugs flowed were, "I love you very much. I will see you on the other side, all of you." After the first injection, a staff member checked his consciousness. Once they confirmed he was no longer responsive, the rest of the process moved forward. By 6:16 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Richard Gerald Jordan was 79 years old. That concludes all executions carried out in the first half of 2025. If you liked this video, make sure to check out the next one, because just when you thought it couldn't get worse, well, it can. And the next cases are even more disturbing.